I find the letter extremely interesting. It's very closely argued. The reasons why the coroner asked for a public inquiry are set out, and then a whole set of reasons are given to rebut them. One of them is almost comic, which is the state of the economy and that a public inquiry will cost more, so is undesirable. There is a much more serious reason, which I think is extremely indicative of how seriously the government is taking this inquest and how worried they are about it. Because at the heart of the reasons, it seems to me the main reason why the Home Secretary has turned down the idea of a public inquiry is because she says that a wider investigation than you, the coroner, are required to hold is not necessary. Now, the coroner began by saying that he wanted to have a broad investigation that would consider the context of Litvinenko's death. And by context, he specified the possible role of the Russian state, the question of the British security services, and perhaps a duty of protection that might have been owed to Alexander Litvinenko if, as is claimed, he was working for them. Now, the letter from the Home Secretary basically rejects that out of hand and says that this is basically no business for the inquest. She is saying that the inquest needs to be narrowly focused on what is his immediate obligation as coroner, which is, and I quote here, by what means Litvinenko was killed, and not the broad circumstances of his death.
And so what kind of conclusion can we really draw from that? I mean, is the letter essentially hinting that the Russian state specifically is involved and that is the only option really under consideration? I mean, what kind of conclusion can we draw from it?
Another aspect, which to my mind has always been at least as interesting as the possible role of the Russian state, which is the possible role, not in the killing, but in the circumstances of the British secret services. That too will be out of account. Essentially, the Home Secretary is saying this is none of the coroner's business at an inquest. The coroner's business is only to look at who Litvinenko was, what he was doing, and how he died. Anything else, any broader political context, is, she considers, irrelevant. And she says that depending on the findings of the inquest, of this narrowly drawn inquest, that the government will then decide whether there may be need for a public inquiry afterwards, but that the first priority is to get the inquest over.
Why do you think the government seems so insistent on having such a narrowly focused inquiry? I mean, in an investigation, obviously, you should be investigating all possible lines of inquiry.
Well, I think this is in part because the coroner's whole reason for wanting a public inquiry was so that evidence that and testimony that the government wants to keep secret could be heard, if not in public, then behind closed doors, but it would still be heard. According to the Home Secretary's letter, this evidence, if the inquest is narrowly drawn, now becomes irrelevant.
And the coroner has said that he, of course, can't conduct his investigation properly without that wider context, as you say, without that proper investigation. So it's difficult to see where this leaves things and how they move forward.
I mean, the Home Secretary says, yes, you can conduct this narrowly. It will all be absolutely fine. You can look at how the polonium arrived in the UK, what its role was, if anything, in the death of Litvinenko, and how he came to die. What's also interesting to me is that right at the beginning of this letter, the Home Secretary, Theresa May, talks about the apparent murder of Alexander Litvinenko. Now, I may be wrong, but I don't think I've heard it described in those terms by a government official before.
What did you make in the letter also when it refers to international relations were a factor in the government's decision not to hold a public inquiry?
Well, I know how it's going to be interpreted. it'll be interpreted as saying that any inquest or any public inquiry that considered the possible role of the Russian state would risk damaging British-Russian relations, as though they're so wonderful already. But I've never thought that that is actually all these references to international relations applies to. I've always thought that it suited the government for the media generally and other people to interpret this as meaning Russia and relations with Russia. I think that equally important is relations between the intelligence services of Britain and the United States.